All right. So off to our next talk by Arlene and Richard Mabe. Arlene is the Director of Cost Research at Unison Cost Engineering with over 38 years experience at building cost models. And for those of us who might be familiar with Price, Price has become Unison in this past year. She's a software measurement expert dedicated to finding creative solutions focused on making software development professionals successful. And Rich Mabe is a solutions consultant for Unison Cost Engineering with 45 years of operations experience, research experience in cost estimating and logistics management. In his current role, he provides training, best practice mentoring, and cost research support for users of true planning in the federal government and for government contractors.
Okay, thanks, Anandi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. And you see my slide?
Yep, they're perfect.
All right, great. So Rich and I today, we're going to talk about, the need. Is there really a need for an Agile program cost estimate at, a higher level than a sprint or an iteration? So cost estimators are generally not software developers. Systems and software engineers are generally not trained to be professional estimators. Agile projects tend to exacerbate this because Agile project management requires collaboration and shared processes close collaboration and shared processes between the cost team and the software team. So what we're going to talk about today, first we'll talk some background. What is the issue? Why do we think this is an important thing for us to be talking about? And why do we think this would be of interest to both the software engineering community as well as the cost community? We'll talk about the different program types and roles. So what are the kind of things that happen in a software project, both from a traditional perspective and an Agile perspective, and what are the different roles in those two different perspectives of the software engineering team and the cost team. And then we'll perform a summary by just focusing on what the role of the estimator is in an Agile software project. So for background, we all know the difference between waterfall and Agile, but sorry, we do all know the difference between waterfall and Agile. I didn't need to talk, that was my transition slide, oops. So here's the issue. We have traditional software engineers. They do the traditional software engineering things. They define requirements, then they do development, they do tests, they deliver the code, hopefully that meets the requirements. They probably provide estimates. In most cases, they'll provide estimates of expected effort, but they don't provide detailed budgets and they don't really support the overall cost estimation process. Not that they don't support it, but they don't get deeply involved in the overall cost estimation process. Traditional cost estimators or analysts, they deal with the detailed life cycle. So they're worried about the cost used to develop high-level budgets, to create affordability assessments, to do cost trade-offs, and to do risk and uncertainty analysis. Some of them may have learned programming, but it's most likely not a primary responsibility. So their focus it's on the understanding enough about the software program and understanding enough about the cost estimating world and the things that decision makers need for them to help the decision makers make good decisions about software programs. But in an agilely managed program, the software team is defining the scope of work in each development increment. And this is based on creating a steady state velocity, the team understanding their own limitations. The team has a great understanding of the capability that needs to be delivered to the customer, specifically a great understanding of the capability that needs to be delivered in the next iteration. They understand all the capabilities in the backlog. Their focus at any given time is understanding to a great level of detail the capabilities in the next iteration or the next sprint. So the question is there still a need to have a cost estimate given the agile, the flexible nature of the sizing metrics that are used and the fact that scope is always changing? It's a dynamic process. So, and as I said, the software team is really focused, most focused on what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks or next month or whatever period of time they have for their regular releases of software. So, it's easy to understand how to come up with a coordinated cost for the traditional development. It's sort of a HUT 2, 3, 4, a march to a schedule with a fixed scope. Frequently adjust costs to account for the growth and schedule delays. Harder to envision this top level estimate in an agile development because it is flexible, it's dynamic, things change. So how do you estimate a variable? Sort of a hey-ho, go with the flow kind of dynamic. However, it's still many businesses, certainly many acquisition contracts require there to be a budget, require there to be some high-level cost analysis before a contract is awarded. So, in a program that's truly agile with a customer that truly accepts, in 6 months, you're going to deliver me a product and you and I are going to figure out going along what that product's going to be, and I'm going to pay you at the end. In that kind of an environment, maybe all we do need to look at is software team size, labor rates, and how long it's going to take. But very few programs and projects of any consequence follow a completely agile process. So there is more to understanding the cost of a program or a project than just the software team size and the labor rates. Okay, successful program management, it's still going to require working software capabilities to be delivered, whether they're delivered with a traditional method, such as waterfall, whether they're delivered with Agile, and they're expected to be delivered on time and within a budget. So yes, a cost estimate is still a good idea for the program management and for the management of the program. The separate roles for the individual software teams and the cost teams in a traditional world will help define what the cooperative roles in a highly collaborative agile team might be. So that's what the next section we're going to talk about. What are the traditional roles? How do we see those roles changing as one goes from a traditional program to an agile program? So certainly key software program characters are still going to need to be applied to the estimate. In order for the cost team to help the software team be successful within a defined budget and schedule. Whether you're agile or not, similar characteristics are going to ensure that the scope of the budget and schedule estimate can be validated and can be maintained even within the flexible, responsive environment created by an agile development project. At this point, I will turn it over to Rich. Tell me when to move the slides, Rich.
Do you have a copy of it? I'm sharing my screen. I was just going to do my own slides.
Oh,
Were you sharing yours too?
yeah, I'm sharing mine.
So which set of slides are we looking at?
Okay, I am on slide number 8.
Okay. I just changed mine to slide number 8.
Okay.
It looks like we're seeing Rich's screen right now.
Okay. Huh. I guess he beat me to it. It says I'm sharing my screen. All right.
Well,
sorry about that.
I'm sorry to have done that to you. I apologize. Hi, my name's Richard. This is my first COCOMO, but I've been a cost estimator for 30 years. I know a lot of you, and I really appreciate these symposiums and these forums like this. We've all become our own best friends over the years. But what I'd like to do now is maybe draw some lines in the sand. I don't claim to be a software engineer. My degree is in geology, which is an understanding of silica at an entirely different perspective. And many of you who are software engineers have studied the economics of your software programs, but you're not necessarily cost estimators. So we'd like to just walk through and discuss some things that we've observed over time as we've supported many programs, watch the transition of Agile inside the government, out of the government, and what are some things that need to be considered now in the cost estimating community, which is different than the software development community, and the objective of where do we need to go to make sure that the program benefits from what we all do. We selected 4 different characteristics of a software program to normalize on and to discuss the roles of the engineer and design team as opposed to the cost estimating group. That would be the delivered product, the size and complexity of that product, the development approach, how we're going to deliver code, test code, and field code, and then the scope and flexibility of that development schedule in an Agile domain. So starting with product, and I want to point out here, I'm probably be making some blatant conclusions. They have been informed by my 30 years in the business, both in industry and as a government estimator. And they're probably focused a little bit more on what happens in government programs per se, and not so much in industry where the objective is to do a bid and proposal for something as opposed to doing a life cycle estimate. But in years gone by, and when I first started doing this a long time ago, generally there was a software team that was in one part of the program. There was a cost team that was in another part of the program. They rarely talked to each other. The software team would build the rigid system specs. They would define the whole program from beginning to end and lay out a multi-year waterfall schedule or some type of increments. And so it was left for the cost team to come in and translate what they did into some sort of a cost work breakdown structure, to identify points in time for design, develop code, unit test, try to deliver some reasonable estimates against that. And the cost team was focusing on predictive estimates of labor and materials and direct costs over time, always looking into the future. Whereas the product team was focused a lot on defining and describing how they were going to deliver capability for the requirement spec. Now, in the Agile world, though, things really did change. Those hard specs with a 5-year waterfall schedule, now they've become roadmaps of minimum capabilities. And I hate to do the analogy, but it's very much like the EVM world, where we have an immediate period of time that we're focused on to get work done, and the rest of them are just planning packages in the future somewhere. We'll worry about them when we get to them. So that roadmap begins to break down into capabilities that are broken down into features that have to be delivered. And then the features become backlog stories that are decomposed into these doable software tasks, either develop a piece of software or fix something or other issues that have to be delivered as part of the software product. The Agile cost team, and yes, a cost team can be Agile. I know that that's hard to believe in some domains. They're going to have to understand that roadmap, and they're going to have to provide a very grand overall estimate of that roadmap story, that grand epic story, if you will. But eventually they're going to have to get down to a granular estimate of the next sprint or the next release, or maybe they've already started looking at the next release down the road that the software people haven't dug into heavily yet. So now with Agile, we're introducing a need to collaborate regularly between the cost and the product team. Not so sure we can live in separate rooms anymore, because the cost is going to emerge from a process. You can't stand there on day one with a large story in your hand and say that you know what the last buckets of code are going to be and what they're going to contain. So the cost is going to emerge over time, just like the product and capabilities emerge over time. And the cost estimator, who is a living part of that Agile team, can also be a critical means of feedback as you begin to plan sprints, as you begin to plan releases. Can you do what you've planned in the amount of time available to you, or do you need to staff up the team? Do you need to break apart the backlog? So as we start working a product now, it's no longer well defined from beginning to end. Now product and cost begin to emerge. And now we see a need for a cost estimator to be a part of the Agile team. Now let's talk sizing, because even before I left the government, I was at the Air Force Cost Analysis Agency, and Renee Wood and I would regularly argue as to whether or not we could abandon SLOC. And she usually won. She's more effective at arguing than I am. But the traditional size that we've used forever and that was incorporated into the SRDRs and that we have really come to trust and depend on has been lines of code of some sort or another. And then we introduced functions and function points, which was a brilliant step forward that gave us a little more degrees of freedom. And we would depend on the software team to tell us as cost estimators how big they thought something was going to be. And then we would take those sizes and some other analogies, and we'd create very clever cost estimating relationships that became wonderful models like SEER and Kokomo and True Planning and many others. And we would march off and run our models based on the information they gave us. Again, living in separate rooms and maybe not even knowing what each other was doing. But in the Agile domain, size has become relative. Size is not necessarily something that the software community wants to commit to heavily, because successful products delivering successful capabilities takes precedence over knowing just how big that capability was going to be. So they begin to assign tasks based on these story descriptions, and the software team will get together and they'll collaborate on how much that size is, because they have to be able to commit to what they can do in any given scrum or sprint or any project interval that they're working. And they're going to use their own story sizing of some sort or another. And we've heard this multiple times through here. A function point is something defensible and definable and mathematical. A story point, or even a t-shirt size or something dropping off of Fibonacci scale, those are just ideas in the mind of the software developer. They know what they mean, but even between team members, they don't always know what each other's talking about. So size became very relative. Now, in the Agile cost environment, the cost estimator has to be able to understand that relative measure. It may change daily, it may change periodically, but they have to be able to understand that relative measure and do something with it. I worked with Wilson for a number of years. I like his idea of upfront. Let's convert things as estimators. Let's go in and lay some logic on it called simplified function points. And DHS has certainly got a wonderful process there. And then we heard him say, yeah, but after it gets started, we don't know as much anymore as we used to. Now we depend on them to work in JIRA and tell us what they're doing and to keep us informed. And if the cost is going to emerge over time and have any credibility or any value to the program manager, to those who are building budgets, to those who are defending budgets, the cost has to include that knowledge and intelligence of those relative sizes and be able to do something with them. And the variables that we can agree on become things like velocity. How much can you do in what period of time, and how many hours will it take? So yes, in a sense, all we have to do is know how many people are on the team and what their labor rates are in order to give you some sort of cost estimate. But the question becomes, how many sprints will that capability require? How many releases will that minimum viable product require? Knowing that is a real critical part of doing an Agile program in a reasonable amount of time for the budgets that's been allocated, especially within the government. And then the approach, like we said before, you march to a schedule. Traditionally, you walk down the waterfall. It was always late. Everything was always delayed. Most of the time it was because you threw something over the wall from development to test. They threw it back, and when they were finished arguing with each other, you threw it over another wall to the customer, and they said, Oh, sure, 5 years ago, that's what we wanted, but now what we want really is something else. It was an entirely new requirement. And so that traditional approach didn't always get us capability, never got it on time and never got it on budget. And the cost people were sometimes left to pick up the ball. I don't know how many times I would hear the software team go in and excuse themselves by saying, well, that's what the cost estimator told me it was going to cost. I can't help it if they're wrong. I would contend it's their fault, but we're not going to blame anybody here. But cost growth always happened. And the software people never seemed to be interested in knowing that cost growth was happening. They were trying to avoid code growth. They were trying to avoid requirements creep, but cost and schedule always changed. So we invented Agile to get away from a lot of that. Now we're focused on just the next iteration. We have a very tight understanding of what it's going to be. We've committed to what we can deliver in that next short iteration. And when we delivered it, it works, people like it, and we move on. Well, the Agile cost team has to be able to keep up with that Agile development team. And they have to be equal to and at least one step ahead. So they're collecting the history of these teams as they go in a specific language or with a specific application type. And they're applying those to the models, not going 2 or 3 years into the future, maybe going 2 or 3 sprints or 1 or 2 releases into the future. And it becomes very Markov-like. The only thing we know about the next sprint is what we learned from the last 5. And we move our estimates in a direction at the same speed and at the same complexity as the Agile development process is going. And it requires a tremendous amount of collaboration. And all of the customers that I work with and that I advise and help, and when I was in government, one thing I never, ever, ever saw was cost people sitting where the software design is taking place and cost people sitting where software programming is taking place. But I'm convinced that that's what needs to happen. That cost needs to move at the same rate and with the same flexibility as the emerging capabilities and program, because cost is going to emerge consistent with what the program team is doing. And then finally, schedule becomes an interesting term. Before we had schedules that were laid out in requirement specs and program documents, and it was wonderful increments and development cycles. But schedule growth was always a factor. One of the reasons the Air Force started a software factory up in Boston was they had a command and control program that was on its 3rd iteration over about a 15-year period and still hadn't been delivered successfully. They needed to get control of that. And for them, an Agile approach was critical. But so in the past, the challenge for the cost team was to keep up with what was happening on the software team, which were these negative delays and negative type things that were going on. And the cost never really could keep up with what was happening. But in the Agile world, workload is scaled for the immediate increment that you're looking at. The development effort is not really considered until the work is scheduled. The release map is not the program schedule. It's just a relative idea of when things are going to occur. And then you go to greater and greater granularity with the software product and software issues. The cost can do that, can go parallel step by step and be better predictive if we know what's happening every day in those scrums and in those sprint teams. Goes from an initial grand estimate, and with many of the commercial people that I advise who are building proposals, all they need is that grand bid. It's going to take this much money, and we can tell you it's probably this many releases or this many sprints, although we're not going to tell you release trains, parallel efforts, or anything else. We'll let somebody else figure that out. But after you get that train started, it becomes granular, things change, the costs are going to change, and you can by being in the room, you can keep up with that. You can truly have an agile, flexible, responsive cost estimate that's as much a feedback and a measure for the software team as the developing capabilities that they're putting out for the program. And then back over, Arlene, to you to summarize all of this.
Okay, so the final section of this presentation, we're going to do a summary talking about where the estimator, how we see it used to be, or what things are the same, what things are different, and who brings what to the table. Next slide, please, Rich. Now that I know you're running the show. So from the product perspective, what's the same? There still needs to be a cost WBS. It needs to be created, but maybe not all at once. Maybe a high level WBS that grows into the product WBS as the product emerges. And what's new? So same is we need WBS still. It requires the cost team to collaborate closely with the software team. The cost team needs to work with the software team to understand the roadmap, to understand what we mean, what the team means when they talk about a minimum viable product and a minimum viable capability, so that there's an understanding from the estimator's perspective of, here's the things that absolutely have to be done. They're the most important things to focus on up front. And then there needs to be constant collaboration, or ongoing collaboration, I should say, to so that the cost team understands as requirements change or emerge throughout the life cycle of the development. So who brings what to the cost estimation team? So the cost team comes with the knowledge of WBS creation and understanding estimating processes. That's what they bring. The software team, or the Agile team, they bring knowledge of the product, understanding of what an MVP is, and understanding of what the Agile process is. And they should be right up front sharing, especially understanding of the Agile process with the cost team, so that as things emerge and change, the cost team is in sync with the software team as much as possible. Next slide. So from a sizing perspective, what's the same? Cost is still a function of effort. And effort is still going to be a function of the size, however we choose to, size it, the complexity, and the capability of the team. The cost team is going to depend more heavily than in a traditional exercise, maybe, but it's going to depend on the software team for size estimates, and for, they're still going to depend on them. It's maybe a different format that the size estimate is going to come in, but the cost team still needs to go to the software team and say, how much are you going to build? So what's new? The cost team has to collaborate, once again, closely and continuously, or in an ongoing fashion, with the software team. They need to understand what those relative size units are that the Agile team is using to size their features, to size their backlog. They need to work with the Agile team to understand the velocity, what velocity that the team has once, as the team gets into a steady state mode. They need to understand that, so they can, using the analytical skills that the cost estimating team has, find a way to convert relative size into tractable size. So something like function points, understanding that, for this team, in these circumstances on this project, we're not saying that there's a conversion from story points to function points, but within a team, especially one that is approaching steady state with their velocity, it is fair to say that there can be tractable size created from relative size and known velocity. And then once again, this ongoing collaboration, they need to be able to account for the changes within each sprint and iteration. So they need to work with the team, because at the end of an iteration, the team's going to have a walkthrough. They're going to talk to the stakeholders and the customers. Things are going to be reprioritized. So, and maybe one feature will be expanded and another will be removed, eliminated, moved to the bottom of the backlog unlikely to make it into the release currently being worked on. So these things all need to be taken into account, both sizes and obviously cost and effort. So the cost team is going to bring knowledge of the calibration process. They're going to bring analytical skills that are focused on taking historical information such as velocity and relative size and turning that into something that they can use in the context of the models that they're using. Software team brings relative size measure along with a relative size measure of the current iteration, relative size measure of the backlog, a knowledge of their velocity, along with probably a fair amount of time helping the cost team understand, here's what relative size means to us, here's the, agile meaning of velocity, working closely. The software team is going to have to work very closely with the cost team to make it possible for them to do analysis and come up with that tractable size. Next slide. From an approach perspective, both teams recognize that code is still going to be developed and a product will eventually be delivered. It may be the minimum viable product. It may be the minimum viable product plus some extra set of features that they were able to fit into the release schedule. The budget there still needs to be a budget created, and it still needs to represent the full cost of the program. And along with the budget needing to be created for most programs and most projects, there's also going to be additional work that the cost team has to do, such as uncertainty analysis, understanding where the risky areas, figuring out where the risky areas are, and hopefully sharing that with the software team, bringing a sense of cost realism to what might be over optimistic software developers. I'm not saying that they all are. I'm one. I used to be one, so I get to say this. Sometimes software developers are over optimistic, and I think the cost team in this close collaboration is in a better position to create, trust that maybe that discussion of maybe this isn't quite as realistic as you think might be more successful. So what's new? The cost team has to collaborate with the software team. You'll notice I say that on every slide. The cost team needs to collaborate with the software team. And similarly, the software team needs to collaborate with the cost team, obviously, to facilitate understanding of near real-time changes that happen. The scope is going to change. The velocity is going to change. And the program dynamics are going to change. The customer may stop participating. Team members may leave, team members may be added, just like any other project, but now it's more important that, in a traditional project, new members come to the team and nobody redoes the cost estimate. Maybe it doesn't have to be redone in every case in an agile environment, but it needs to be part of the conversation. Ideally, at least one member of the cost estimating team would involve themselves enough, maybe not sit there and watch the developers code every day, but at the end of every iteration, a good agile team, they do a walkthrough with the customer where the customer says what they like and what they don't like that's been added in the last release. They do a reprioritize the backlog potentially based on what they saw and what, Rich talked about how, 5 years down the road, the customer says, yeah, that was my requirement 5 years ago. Well, even if it's only been a month ago, yes, that was my requirement a month ago, but now that I've seen it, I see a way to make it better. And that's more important to me than doing this feature that's further down in the backlog. Maybe we spend more time on this. So this happens once every iteration. Following that, once again, a good agile team has what they call a retrospective. Retrospective is where they sit down and talk about what did we do right, what did we do wrong, how do we see things changing just within the team. And ideally, there would be a member of the cost team that would spend time in this walkthrough listening to the customer, that would spend time in the retrospective listening to the team talk about, this is going to change things, our velocity is going to change, but ideally having a cost team as a member of the Agile team, not a full-time participant in the Agile team, obviously, but as a regular attendee to Agile related meetings, maybe not going to the stand-up every day, but at least attending a walkthrough or a retrospective or both. So back to what's new, the cost factors aren't fixed. So the estimate, measure, adjust cycle that Rich talked about, this cycle will, in a good Agile team, without too many program dynamic changes, will reach steady state and be something that is measurable. So who brings what to the cost estimation team? The cost team brings the ability to assess size, complexity, and capability. And they bring the capability to take this information, which they will need to collaborate with the software team to come up with, and turn it into a cost, effort estimate, cost, effort, and schedule estimate, as well as they will be able to use this information to do the risk analysis, the uncertainty analysis, analysis of alternatives, things like that that need to be done at least at the beginning of a program and may need to be done anytime there's a major change in direction or dynamics. And the software team is bringing real-time knowledge, updates as the requirements emerge and change. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So as far as the schedule is concerned, what's the same? There needs to be a schedule for business planning and budgeting. It's an ugly fact of building software that you're going to sell, building software under contract. You got to have a schedule, whether you're Agile, whether you're traditional, whether you're somewhere in between. What's new is the schedule is not driven by scope. Scope is allocated by schedule. And what's good about this, I think, is the software team works to deliver features per iteration rather than rushing to meet a prescribed schedule. So many of us are aware of projects that have happened over time where the schedule had to be met. There was a contractual obligation to meet the schedule. There were penalties for not meeting the schedule. And what would happen is, as the project maybe got a little behind, things like complete testing and things like that might fall off the end of the schedule. In an Agile environment, in a good Agile environment, people are doing things like test-driven development. Features don't get to be accepted into an iteration that haven't been tested. They do things like continuous integration with automated testing. So the end of an iteration, the implication at the end of the iteration is that there's built-in quality based on some of the Agile practices that have been applied. So you don't run into a situation where you decide to add extra features just to make a schedule. You've made the conscious decision to get it right before you move on to the next feature. And the cost teams work with the software team, managing the cost changes associated with optimizing scope delivered within a schedule. So a great value that the cost team brings to the table is that they're on the side of looking at the cost, understanding the cost, and looking at what the risks are based on their historical knowledge of software development in general and their growing knowledge of Agile development. They are in a great position to help the software team optimize the scope that gets delivered within a schedule for a particular release, because they can guide decisions based on their view of history, their understanding of cost, which is a different understanding of cost than the software people, and their emerging knowledge of Agile. So here, the cost team is going to validate the schedule. They're going to do it in the context of changing requirements and costs. And they're going to help the software team understand if the scope is really going to fit into the sprint or into a release, or a sprint or iteration or into a release in their, based on their analysis. And, the software team is continuously reprioritizing features and stories. They also are interested in optimizing the scope that's delivered within the schedule that they've been given for an iteration and for a release. Next slide, please. Couple final thoughts. And when I get done this, Rich, if you have anything to add, please feel free to pipe in, or you can pipe in now if you want. So yes, we believe that a cost estimate supporting a budget is still a good or great idea. I mean, it's not just a useful tool for the PM, it's also a useful tool for the software engineering team or the Agile team. It's more than a resource loaded schedule. It's going to include, probability of success, and viability of schedule. So the software team is probably not doing the kind of analysis that the cost team does, especially at the beginning of a project, but also when, dynamics in a project change or scope in a project changes or whatever. But the cost team is on top of not just a budget, not just a schedule, not just how that budget fits into that schedule, but also how viable is it? But we have to remember that we're in a dynamic Agile environment. We need to be flexible about cost because, the backlog is going to change. The backlog is going to reprioritize. So changes require re-estimation and, reevaluation of both the cost and the risk for both the PM and for the engineers or the Agile team. And it requires a focused estimator, not just an extension of, you're not just one of the software engineers who's, writing down what people say during the planning meetings and says, okay, here's how much it's going to take. Ideally, there's a cost person, someone whose job is cost estimator or cost analyst, who is a, adjunct part of the engineering Agile team and who participates not every day, but regularly with them regularly and on an as needed basis with the Agile team to make sure that the cost and schedule are staying in sync with the dynamics of the project. It's got to be a collaborative effort. Cost estimator, part of the team, not just an isolated effort for searching for the next cost or the best cost. That next slide. I'm sorry, Rich, anything you want to add before you go to the next slide?
No, I was going to look at the chat and see if there was any questions asked along the way that we ignored.
Okay. And if you didn't put it in the chat and you want to ask it now, we're ready to cut into lunch, but I'm perfectly happy. Oh, I guess we're not ready to cut into lunch. We're ready to cut into break. You guys are ready to cut into break. We're ready to cut into lunch.
I'm just enjoying for the moment Dan Strickland talking about goofballs in Huntsville.
Hi, it's Jim Alstead.
Hi, Jim.
I really liked this talk. I think you guys made quite a contribution to explaining the issues here. I particularly like Rich's 4-part charts on, how the roles changed. And under the Agile cost team, I think his point on you really need the cost estimator to be working directly with the software team was well taken. Speaking for myself, though, I did find that some of the points there were kind of abstract. So I didn't understand, how when the software team finishes a sprint, exactly how does the cost estimator take the information and use it to adjust his cost and schedule information?
So I would pretend that the cost estimator is keeping a numerical track of things like velocities and skills. If the sprint said we can do these many tasks in this amount of time, which would imply a velocity of how many, story points or whatever they're measuring per hour of effort. If they ended up doing more or less, that's going to show up in the track that they're keeping. And so it's like I said, it's like almost like a Markov. You're in this current state. Before you leap to the next state, which is the next sprint or release or whatever, adjust your velocities, adjust your complexities for that team, and give them a new going forward, what it may cost as they, and then hopefully you approach steady state. So you reach the knee on that curve, and then it's just a straight out estimate from there. But it's that dynamic of measure and adjust as you go from state to state through the Agile schedule.
Well, does the cost estimator have any responsibility to report implied changes in scope up to the program manager?
Cost people aren't usually asked for a lot, and they're usually told they're wrong when they bring the cost to the program manager. But I think in this case, the tools that we've been looking at and the things that I've seen, you can measure how much effort took place across, pick a denominator, across stories or across functions or across whatever, across team members. And what you'd be looking for is the dynamics of that and plotting that over time. Now, I worked with a group at Hanscom that was proposing metrics that could be delivered to the program manager that included those types of measures so that you were keeping up. And I know Jira does some of that stuff. So it's, yeah, whoever has the numerics could go back to the program manager with the knowledge that they have. Are they required to? In many instances, not right now, but they could. And that's the point I'm trying to make. They can become a collaborative member of the team and not just this annoying person in the next room that says that's going to cost more than you have in the budget.
Okay, thank you.
There is a question in the chat from Carol. Carol, if you're able to unmute, would you like to ask in voice?
It's always
Okay,
difficult to find the unmute at the time. But if Richard and Arlene can read that, hopefully it's clear what I'm talking about here.
All right, so let's bring it over. How does the Scrum team adjust the velocity when the sprint hour capacity hours available? So varies by the number of available calendar days, varies by holidays. And like I say, it becomes a moving data exercise. And I keep going back to state theory because that's what state theory is. It's a moving data exercise. It's not quite like a 3-period moving average. It's more like gather what you know and leap to the next state. And if you're wrong, gather what you know and leap to the next one. And in fact, they could maybe well inform how many days this one might take, or what should the team size be, or, where can we get economies with the rates that we're going through. So it just becomes another good source of tracking data and metrics that can feed, because you're looking at maybe just one sprint or one release into the future. You're not trying to pick a factor that's going to take you out for 6 or 8 or 10 months. You're going to adjust it every 30, 60, 90 days, whatever. I know the tendency nowadays is releases to be moving into about 30-day windows. So you're just another bucket of really useful data that can turn out metrics that'll help guide the planning and the execution of the program as you go from iteration to iteration across
if an iteration is not the same every time. So if I've got, the thing that's common is I might do a 3 calendar week sprint. So that assumes 15 calendar days. But if I have 3, it's at Christmas, I've got 3 calendar days that are not going to be worked. I've got a team that varies from 3 to 6. They're available sometimes up to 60%, but that may vary. The number of hours that they're actually working on dev versus ops varies. Do you adjust when it's story points per sprint? That assumes that you've got an objective or repeatable story points, which I get from a team that can be reliable. But when you say per sprint, if that's a variable content of the available hours, are you adjusting for that when you're figuring out how much scope capacity or how much scope you can put in, how many story points you can put into a future sprint?
I like that question a lot. I don't know if I have the exact answer. Story points per sprint is probably a relative over a relative, and we all know what happens when you invite bad relatives at Christmas. I would try to find something that was like you're leading to a little bit predictable, but within some variance range. So it may be, I don't know if I would go for story points because they're so speculative. I really do like simplified function points, but if the programmers aren't talking in terms of simplified function points, it doesn't do the cost team much good.
The biggest issue to me is the sprint capacity. When you say it's something per sprint, that assumes that there is a consistency or an objectiveness about what is a sprint. It's kind of like saying function points per project.
Yeah, and I think what I'm trying to say is, if in this release, the sprints are all going to last for this long because there's no holidays, but in the next
Right.
release, they're going to be different. So now with Justin, what's our forecast in the next release? Because it's going to be a little different than the one we're in now. I think what I'm trying to say is be as dynamic as the things going on around you in an Agile program. I'm waffling a little. Carol, you're asking a wonderful
Well,
question.
you know what, and I understand it if we've got a consistent team size, if we've got consistent work that we're all doing dev and we're not going into ops and doing fixes and stuff like that. I get that. It's when you've got a variable team and people are off and you've got different percentages. And I used to deal with this with people that would say, oh, we can't use function points. We've figured out how to track our time finally. And I go, you know what, we're not even going to talk about function points, because if you're just starting to record your time as opposed to 40 hours a week, we're not even in the same ballpark to talk about measurement. So I'm just curious, because I hear Agile teams that I've worked with say, oh, we've got the velocity in terms of something per sprint. And I go, what's in your sprint? What's the hours capability? And they look at me like I'm an idiot, like, well, it's a sprint. And I go, but they're all different sizes in terms of hour capacity. And they go, so I was just wondering if you guys had figured out a way of resolving that.
It's a good question. Now, what we've done is we have a variable way to set up the model. So you say, okay, this team. So instead of describing a piece of code that's going to be done, we first describe a team that's going to do some work, and then we assign them a certain amount of capacity to perform in the next however many period of time. Now, and of course, we've discovered all the things you've discovered. The only thing constant in Agile is constant change, but you try to hope that maybe they'll lead towards something predictable in aggregate over time, at least by team or maybe by application type or by something.
And the reason I ask is partially because people get fixated on the exactness of story points or function points or simple function points or anything like that. And they completely throw out the window the fact that we're measuring different efforts. And so that to me is a huge problem. It's like, oh yes, every minute is 60 seconds and every hour is 60 minutes. But if we're measuring different things every time, that's a big issue.
And so the point is, don't try to find the same thing every time. Measure it uniquely for each time. So as you're in that period of time planning the next sprint or the next release, take some time to look where you've been, readjust, and measure or estimate for the next one, but don't go 3 or 4 into the future, because you may not regress to the point you can trust. You have to be as flexible as the team that's saying, well, this time I'll do these backlog items because I think I can fit them in and arrange it. And then
So you're
say,
talking
okay,
much more on the basis of iterations and releases than working with the Scrum team on actual sprint by sprint. And that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
But also you should over time be able to come up with an average effort per story point.
Right.
For
And
this team, for
that's
this
different
time.
than per sprint.
No, I agree.
This
But
is
that is-
Dave. This is Dave Seaver. I just wanted to comment, most of the Agile teams I've worked with, we do the measurement on the release, not
Yeah.
on the sprint. It tends to get too burdensome to do it on the sprint basis. Plus, there's usually a planning cycle for the release, which mitigates a lot of these issues that Carol's bringing up.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Dave.
One thing I am doing is I'm trying to gather as much publicly available Agile information as I can get to try to answer some of the questions that you just raised, Carol. Is there predictability? I think to date, I'm assuming that everything is purely random in an Agile program. There's zero correlation between anything and anything. So I'm going to try to see if that's true or not. If it is, it makes the predictability just as tough as we think it is. But I think we can normalize. I've always contended, and I think I've seen evidence that a team that stays cohesive over one or two cycles becomes predictable by about the third or fourth one. And if all we get is maybe 3 or 4 predictable iterations at a time, that's better than everything being random upon random.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Definitely.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Arlene and Rich, for the very interesting presentation, and everyone for the discussion afterwards. So we're just a little bit late in starting our break, but let us start our break now. Our break is going to go until 11. And I just want to make a quick announcement. We have had to make a slight change to our schedule today. So it's just going to be a switch of talks. Jim Alstad, who was scheduled at 4, is going to be at 11:45. And Celia switched with him. So now her presentation is at 4. But other than that, the schedule is the same. So come back at 11 and we'll be back with good presentations.